Continuing now, we're going to combine his last two sections into our final part here. And there's references to stuff in the previous parts. For example, when he went to the right-wing rally, there's quotes from that here in these bits too. So you have to kind of listen to all this in order. But let's wrap this up, okay? From Guatemala and Ecuador and Honduras and Nicaragua, they were coming. And at Father Sean's migrant center, a man held up his little girl for you and me to remember. She clasped her chubby hands together. Her mouth and eyes went wide at me. Her forehead was studded with measles or chicken pox or maybe insect bites. I remember the open smile of another small child, while its mother smiled at me more sadly or warily. And not far across the line, up in Green River, Arizona, a man raised the main question. Speaking about that rally, one of the audience members asked, Larry here at Quail Creek. You know, you've said a lot of things that most of us in here believe. There are a lot of people that don't believe what you're saying. Is there any thought process or thinking about how do you get through to people who are just denying that this even exists? Colfage, that person referred to, who was, one of the people putting together this raising money for the building of the wall. Well, I think the people who are just flat out denying it, it's very difficult to convince them otherwise because they're not open-minded enough to see the issue. But we have 60 million people who voted for President Trump, and we believe that those people all supported border security. And then McCabe, might be some here tonight. Stormy applause with whoops and at least one delighted, goddamn. Gulfage, we have been receiving many donations from Democrats as well, and they tell me, Brian, I don't support President Trump, but I know that border security and protecting the American people is an important issue. I think it's a slim amount of people who don't support it, and they want our country to be invaded, more or less. They don't care. They're socialists. They think that America has everything and everything else should have everything. Everyone else should have everything. I don't believe in that. I worked hard for everything. Close quote. Rachel Wilson must not have worked hard for everything, because when I asked her what percentage of legals and illegals should be denied entry in order to prevent rape, murder, and terrorism, she replied, quote, the thing is, because I don't believe that immigration enforcement is the way to prevent rape, I don't believe in limiting the number of people who come into the United States. Close quote. What should be the role of ICE? Quote, I would like to shut them down completely. From my point of view, the problems that people see with immigration are not the result of immigration. They're the result of other things. For instance, some people say more immigration means more Americans out of jobs, but that can be fixed by upholding our labor laws, establishing a minimum wage. Other people say there's more crime, and that's not true. And anyhow, we already have laws against crime. We humans have been migrating around the world since we came into existence. We crossed the Bering Strait to get onto this continent. Close quote. The No More Deaths volunteer said, quote, I think there's this idea that people are safer in enforcement nation states. I don't think that ICE has a place in any cooperative society, close quote. She must not have worked hard for everything either. The same went for 4 of her fellow volunteers, who had just been found guilty of trying to save other human beings from dying of thirst. What right did they have to give away our American water? About the latest little contretemps, the one that the drop the charges sign that he referred to several times that people had were addressing. She said, quote, so our volunteers who just got convicted, and we're appealing, we're putting water out on Cabeza Prieta, which is the wildlife refuge next to the bombing range in the West Desert. It's one of the longest stretches of remote land that people have to cross. The ambient temperatures get very high. There is no water. There's just a handful of Border Patrol beacons, but depending where you are, they're hard to locate, and there is no water at them. We had previously been getting permits to go out to that land base, and when they explicitly precluded people from putting out aid, and then in the incident in question, which happened in August, our volunteers didn't get permits because they did not want to sign a document saying that they would not put aid out. And what's happening on Cabeza Prieta is that there's a very high concentration of remains recovered in that area. When we first started going out, our volunteers were finding multiple sets of remains on day trips, close quote. There's a footnote here. The permitting process, this is a quote, the permitting process was about civil penalties. It did not actually, in the document, include any criminal penalties unless you were going to be flying a drone. We kind of get a feeling from Fish and Wildlife that they do not feel that it is their job in any way to protect human life in the areas they have jurisdiction over, close quote, she said. I asked what specifically those Good Samaritans had been convicted of. Quote, basically, the judge did find our volunteers. The judge did find our volunteers guilty of abandonment of personal property and driving on designated roads because it's in a protected wildlife area. And there's miles of roads in Cabeza Prieta. So the idea that they're protecting a pristine wilderness is a bit of a misunderstanding of the case. Cabeza Prieta used to be a bombing range and is still covered with military ordinances. Here's the footnote there. On August 17, 2017, the four were discovered by an employee of the Fish and Wildlife Service, which, as the No More Deaths volunteer put it, adjudicates Cabeza Prieta. Quote, and they had a conversation about whether or not our volunteers were with our organization, and they said they were. And they asked whether they were putting out food and water, and they said they were. What's in contest here is that they were driving on a road for about 0.8 of a mile. These roads are not designated for personal use. And then they were met by Fish and Wildlife, who took them back to an area where they had left food and water by Charlie Bell Well, which is a water catchment for animal use, not safe for human consumption. They had left a cache of water there because one of the ways people can get sick while traveling is by drinking contaminated water. And they were driven back to the Cabeza Prieta office. The Fish and Wildlife officer who met them took all the food and water and put it into his vehicle and drove it back to his office. And they were then given their supplies back after taking an inventory. That was kind of the last we heard of it until the case at some point was suggested for prosecution. On the day of that exchange, our volunteers were not arrested. There was no indication that this would lead to anything besides a potential civil ticket. Close quote. What was the tone? Open quote. I think the Fish and Wildlife officer that day was fairly polite. They can be respectful in their enforcement of inhumane policies. And then there was no indication that this would lead to further charges. And then our volunteers were indeed charged criminally. Close quote. 2 counts of harboring and 1 of conspiracy is coming up. I think that's not for this, though, something later. Okay. I asked whether she suspected that the authorities had decided to make an example of the 4 volunteers. Quote, it's hard to say, really. I will say that, for example, we have another of our volunteers, Scott Warren, facing 20 years in prison under felony charges. This is for 2 counts of harboring and 1 of conspiracy. And that case is going to go to trial in May. He was arrested 8 hours after we released a report about Border Patrol destruction and interference with our humanitarian aid supplies. If you look at the media coverage of that case, this is of the volunteer Scott Warren, there is a large amount of discovery involving communications between Fish and Wildlife and Border Patrol in regards to surveillance of our organization. So I can't speak to the specifics of the Cabeza misdemeanors, but it certainly seems retaliatory in nature, close quote, 55. She later remarked, quote, they, the Border Patrol, would like to target us because we are bringing to light instances of systemic abuse, close quote. Evidently, Fish and Wildlife could not speak to the specifics either because they refused to comment. CBP, when asked whether it had coordinated with Fish and Wildlife in this way, said, quote, absolutely not, close quote. This volunteer continued, quote, "We have a higher moral calling as people of consciousness in the borderlands to provide food and water to people when we meet them in the desert, regardless of status. Our volunteers have dealt with criminal prosecution in the past. In 2005, 2 of them were charged with human trafficking, and those charges were ultimately dropped. So I think this, in some ways, is just a replay of criminalization of our aid workers," close quote. But after all, what if those border sneakers were rapists? Hadn't the president, quote, "What percentage of the migrants are criminals?" I asked the Mexican policeman who had hidden his face. Quote, "Maybe 10%. Quote, "What's your personal feeling about the border wall?" Quote, "We're all the same. We're going to the same spot, so there should be no border wall." Close quote. I don't think he was referring to the United States. Then he said, quote, "Oh, it's not the way that people tell it. It's not how the news puts it out. I'm no one to criticize, but only the people who are going through it are the ones can understand what they're going through." Close quote. I tried to understand it. Oh, I did. Riding around in cars with my wallet full of money and my warm hotel room every night. Sometimes it felt strange that I had so much and these others had nearly nothing. But hadn't I worked hard to be born American? Back and forth, the taxis whizzed me, paralleling those tall slats of rusty wall with their new sproutings of razor wire on Quail Creek's side, while on this side, the side that President Trump stood so generously determined to protect me from, were affixed white wooden crosses bearing such names as Boy Child 2 months and Victor Santillan de la Cruz, age 36. "Think of all the money both criminals' deaths saved Joe taxpayer," says William Vollman. He's quite sarcastic, but in a good way. I think his bitterness is earned. Returning to Vollman. Peering through the wall, I discovered that the Arizona portion of Nogales had already recommenced. I saw a fancy golden pickup truck and a shiny red sport utility vehicle parked in front of opulent houses, one of which kept 2 porch lights on, let's say to welcome any migrants. Here on the Mexican side had been planted 2 metal stick figures. The green one, whose faceless head sphere read U.S. Border Patrol, chasing a red one, whose head bore a compass-like conjunction of 2 4-pointed stars, the white one beneath the dark, while the torso wore the likeness of a soldier standing vigil by some sort of draped altar from which a cross sprouted. What did that mean? The border patrolman ran jerkily in place, its arms threateningly outstretched, while its quarry sprinted rightward with more apparent fleetness, for its front knee bent deeply, and its rear leg pressed not only backward, but upward. That's that image he's referring to. In the final section, Section 15 here, America Saved. I left Tucson on February 14th. That's of this year, folks. On Saturday, February 16th, the New York Times headline ran, "Trump calls emergency, defying Congress, constitutional clash as critics confront power grab on wall." In For Whom the Bell Tolls, Hemingway's doomed and dashing hero gets asked by his Spanish Civil War comrades whether our United States could be likewise infested by fascists. He informs them, quote, "There are many who do not know they are fascists, but will find it out when the time comes." Close quote. William T. Vollman in Harper's Magazine, At the Border of the United States with Mexico, July 2019.